All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's probably the last day of the conference and in the afternoon session. So my name is Himanshu Bari. I'm part of the product team at ThreatMetrics. And this afternoon, we have a series of 3 sessions as part of this masterclass. This is the second session in the series. Before me, my colleague Stephen gave an overview of us as a company and our digital identity network. In the next 2 sessions, I'm going to talk about how this digital identity network of ours can be better used for the workforce authentication use case. And in the third session, it's going to be about using our digital identity network and the integration hub in the cloud to integrate with other third-party data providers to further augment the authentication and account opening related use cases. So for folks who missed the first half of the session, I'm not going to spend too much time, but just to give you an overview of who we are as a company. We've been in business for a good while now. We like to believe that probably outside of the biggest web properties like Facebook and Google, we have the biggest network of user interactions online. We deal with about 75 to 80 million daily transactions. These is logins, payments, new account openings, all types of transactions that users are doing online across e-commerce, financial, and other websites. More than 30,000 of these websites, and over 4,500 of these customers. Some more numbers. On a typical month, we're looking at about 2 billion of these transactions that we analyze. 800 million out of those which are mobile devices. And then across all of these, we track around 400 million digital identities. And it's a global network covering 200 countries. We track about 40 million attacks, and about 100 million new devices get added to our network every month. So it's a massive scale. And this scale is what really makes it more applicable to the typical workforce authentication use case. And before I talk about that, the broad range of solutions that we as a company enable span from fraud prevention to the authentication one, which we'll focus on today, as well as threat detection. On getting to the workforce authentication use case, the first question is like, why? Why do you care about marrying the digital identity of a user to what they are trying to do within the enterprise? And the answer is quite straightforward. I use my mobile phone for authenticating on all types of websites that belong to ThreatMetrics. And many a times people use their own personal devices for logging into their corporate websites. So everything that they're doing online is applicable within the walls of your corporation. Rather, those walls don't exist anymore. And this means that a device, as it's behaving online, and when that device gets compromised, it has huge implications for you as a corporation. If just knowing that the username and password that is entered on their website is correct is not enough, because somebody might have taken over that user's account. So knowing the risk behind a valid username and password is increasingly important for that. So by marrying the digital identity network with the authentication transaction that's happening in the walls of your corporation, allows you to tackle 3 basic use cases. One is obviously it adds the risk context to the login to the authentication transaction. It can reduce your login friction, so you can reduce unnecessary step-ups that you have to do for your users. Oftentimes we see that every time you're trying to log in, you might be stepped up with additional verification required for your company's website. You don't have to do that if that device is the one that you've been using for the last 1 month or ever since you've been with the company to log into their website. There is no need for your company to ask you to do a second-factor authentication. As well as on reducing IP fraud theft. If the account credential that's logging into their website is being compromised, doesn't matter whether it's the right credential or not. By stopping that, you're stopping basically IP theft. The user analytics is another area which is very interesting when we talk to customers. For us to provide this risk context to the transaction, we have to track the user's behavior online, gather a lot of information around everything around that device and the user, including the browser, the IP, the OS, and so on. So all of this rich data set is available when you are bringing that in context to your workforce authentication as well. Because, and then you can use that data set for various different internal analytics, ranging from compliance, knowing what types of patches exist on devices, or what browsers people are using, or what types of cloud services are being most frequently accessed by our workforce. All of that can be done because we capture all of that data as part of this integration. And the last part is the more of a topic of the third session, which is by having an integration endpoint in the cloud, you can then further seamlessly integrate with other API endpoints that are out in the cloud, as well as internal sites that have a REST API-based endpoint. You can do a seamless integration, for example, with your SIM analytics solution. Whatever data is being captured from the device and by the user by our network can be fed into your SIM analytics solution as well. So today I'm going to focus on our integration with Ping Identity, specifically with the Ping Fed solution that's deployed on-premise. So before I give a brief demo of the end-to-end workflow, in the most simple cases, the way it works is the user is trying to access some sort of a cloud application, be it Salesforce or Dropbox or what have you. The login transaction will be redirected to Ping Fed, which will present the login page to the user. And that's when our device profiling will happen. We'll capture a lot of information about the user, their browser, the IP, and everything that we can because of our tags embedded on that particular, on the login page. And then we use that to tie to our digital identity network, the one that I spoke about with the massive scale, and come up with a risk score that is then leveraged to know whether you want to pass this user along, you want to reject the transaction, or you want to step that user up. So simply that's the flow. I wanted to show that to you live. So hopefully the demo gods cooperate with me and this demo works. So let's see. All right, so this is the login page. So we have a risk policy running within our network. And what that policy is simply doing for the sake of this demo is looking at the type of browser that the user is logging from. If it's Chrome, then we are going to let the person go. If it's Firefox, then we'll do a step up for that user. And if it's Safari, then we will just reject the transaction. So this is an example of any login page that your user is going to see. So as the page comes up and I'm entering the credentials, behind the scenes, the profiling of this page and this device has already happened. And we captured all the information about what we can from the device and the user, and we're trying to tie it to the identity of the user as we have in our network. So when I click sign on, basically what's happening now is Ping Fed is actually rerouting a call, making an API call into our network, receiving a risk score about this particular user from our network. And in this case, the policy that we configured got triggered. And since it was Chrome, we said, yes, let it go. And whatever applications you would have configured at this point would show up. I don't have any to show here. So let's try to do the same transaction over Firefox now. So I'm entering valid credentials. So what's going to happen at this point is my phone is configured, so I need to do the second factor authentication. I have Ping ID configured, so I'm just going to scan my fingerprint, and it says authenticated. And this was because, for example, as an example in this demo, we use the Firefox browser, but this is typically, hundreds of other rules that basically go and run in the background to evaluate the risk of the transaction. That we will say, okay, great, the credentials are fine, but it looks like this is a risky user or a device, and you might want to step that user up. And the last part is on Firefox, on Safari. I won't run through that whole process again, but the user will see a page like this. Now this page and this template is completely configurable, but it's kind of case in point. The key things to note here is a very seamless experience. There is no additional things that the user notices. The user doesn't really even know that an additional risk context is actually being added to their authentication transaction. Our API, the SLAs that we have our customers typically range in a few milliseconds. So usually in 100 to 300 milliseconds, the response and the risk rating is returned back into ping fed. So your users won't see any sort of additional latency in the login transaction at all. Okay, so great. So now let's try to double click a little bit and look at actually what's actually happening behind the scenes. So a bit more detailed version of the workflow than what we just saw. So basically what's happening is the first step is the user will browse to the SaaS application. They will enter the link to Box, Salesforce, what have you. The SaaS application is actually then going to redirect to PingFed. PingFed at this point presents the login page that we just saw. That login page is where, like I was saying, has the threat metrics JavaScript tags embedded on top of it. And then behind the scenes, that profiling is happening. The profiling itself takes anywhere from a second to 4 seconds. So in the amount of time that the user is actually entering the username and password, the profiling is typically complete. Once the profiling happens on number 3, the transaction is sent back to threat metrics. So the profiling data sent to threat metrics and PingFed making a call into our API, into our network are two separate paths. The profiling is happening in the background. And once the user enters their password and hits login, that's when PingFed will actually make an API call into threat metrics, passing in an ID and saying that, hey, what do you think about this particular user? Based upon the ID that is passed in by PingFed in that API call, we tied back to the profiling session that happened when the login page was first presented. And then we use that to run our policy behind the scenes and then present a decision back to the user. So currently, the integration basically works off of a simple risk rating. So we just say pass, review, or fail. So there is flexibility that you have on the PingFed configuration side to do what you wish based upon the risk rating that we return. Yes? Right. So in order for the solution to work, our profiling needs to kick off. So the profiling tags need to be embedded on the page on which the user enters their username and login. Now, sometimes, like the workflow that I showed you was the IDP-based workflow. Now, in the case where your services are acting as a solution provider and you don't actually own the login page, the user might be entering the login in the credentials on some partner website that is basically just sending you a SAML assertion, and then you let the user in when you get the assertion. In that workflow, when the login page is not presented to the user, there is a capability where you can stand up just a redirection page that just shows like a spinning circle to the user that says, redirecting you to the right page. And on that redirection page is where our profiling tags will be then embedded. So the user doesn't have to enter the username and password for the profiling to happen. Any web page that basically loads on their end device, be it a mobile device or a desktop, is where our tags are embedded are enough to do the profiling. Okay, so didn't mean to go through the entire configuration on the PingFed side, but wanted to show some of the knobs that are available for configuration here. So threat metrics policy name is the risk policy that is configured in our platform, and I'll show that to you in a second. So you have to specify which risk policy you want to run. So typically, we have our customers having separate policies depending upon the use case. So there will be a separate policy for login-related use cases. You might want to have a separate policy depending upon maybe the region in which the user is going to log in and so on. So there's all kinds of flexibility available. You can customize the policy as you like. The user ID field, this is the field that we want to know where the username is coming from. The input IP address mode, so getting the user's IP address is very useful. in doing things like figuring things out like IP spoofing and so on. So this basically allows us to know how to capture the IP address. And for the demo, we had disabled it, but you can either do it using the servlet, or there is some XSXF configuration that we can use to capture the user IP. The session query API failure action. So if the query into the threat metrics API fails, then what to do is what this thing allows you to control. The update API is something that we allow ping to make a call back into us. So I showed you the case where I had to do a step up using my phone. So the result of the step up is also fed back into our network. So we can then use that as well for decisioning on that particular user next time. So that is made using an update API call. If that API call fails, then you can configure what to do. Ignore risk rating. No, you can, we have some customers wanting to run this in a silent mode where they really don't want to actually impact their user workflow in the beginning. They just want to have this deployed where the API call goes out, we return the risk rating, but nothing gets impacted on the user side. So if you just ignore the risk rating that we return, that's basically like running the integration in a silent mode. So you might want to do that for a few weeks before you actually turn it on to see what kind of data you capture and how the end-to-end workflow is running. Yes?
Turn that off for a few weeks while you're analyzing. Do you have visibility to it? Do you see dashboards and reports to see what happened?
Yes, so I'll show you in a second. Every event that comes into on the threat metrics side, we log that, and you see all the data associated with it. So even if you are turning off, this is just turning off ping fed doing anything with the response that we send, but everything is logged, and you have the dashboards and access to the data. The timeout we just set to 60 seconds. This is on the high side for the demo. Step-up authentication or adapter. In this case, we are using ping ID, but I believe there is flexibility to use other step-up authentication providers as well. So you can configure the one that you're using. What else is interesting? Yes, the failure templates. So the types of pages that your user will see on failure, you can completely customize that, and you can even change the CSS around that. So this is just pointing to the ones that you have configured. And I think that's pretty much it. There are more settings around just how to deploy the adapter, and more things that you have to do before actually turning it on, but not so interesting from our standpoint of discussion. Yeah. Any questions on just enabling the adapter on the PingFed side? Yes. Right. That's correct. Yes. So the question was, is an IDP adapter? It does have to be part of the authentication workflow. That's correct. Yeah. So the DSP adapter is something that we have created and tested, but I don't have a configuration here. But like I was saying, the SP adapter workflow will work by having an intermediate page that just shows the redirection where the profiling happens, because in the SP adapter workflow, you don't actually own the login and the login page. Yes?
Is there a fail open setting? So if I can't reach threat metrics and get response in 60 seconds in your example here,
right.
Will I let the user through automatically, or do you just use it what's the default?
I believe you have complete flexibility there. There was the setting here that says, session query API failure action. So this is where you can just say continue. So you let the user through, so it will fail open. Great, thank you. Right, good question. So the question was more on our network, saying that, well, the sort of the touch point into our network starts with the device, and then everything that we capture around the device and what's happening on the device. So how do you actually derive a user or a digital identity based on that? So that's definitely the secret sauce. But in simple terms, a device doesn't interact with any web or property or anything by itself. Like a device is always associated with a bunch of things around it, including the user identity that you entered, in this case for login, the email, or it can be an email address or your account ID, the IP address from where the login happened, the browser attributes. If you're doing a payment transaction, there is shipping address, billing address. If you're opening new accounts, there is phone numbers that you would enter. So you can think of it as a giant graph, right? So the device identifier that we create for a particular device is not isolated by itself. It's actually associated with all of these different entities. And then we know the strength of the association based upon how much we are seeing the entities together. We know the risk around that based upon what we've seen on the combination of those entities. So basically, we derive the user's digital identity using all of these transactions. But the base out of that is seeing what we've seen together, and were they part of good interactions or bad interactions, and then using that to derive the digital identity. Absolutely not. Yeah, no. So what gets sent into us is completely controlled by the customer. So in our input APIs, we have fields for the users, email, address, what have you. But what actually gets sent into us is completely up to the customer who is doing the implementation. So the profiling, the device profiling that is actually happening doesn't really capture any PII information, unless in EU, they are saying IP is PII as well. But that's a separate discussion. But beyond that, right, we don't really capture any PII. All the PII that gets entered into our network is because it's basically a network, and as part of the network effect, you get out of it what you put into it, right? So if you want to know if a particular login transaction is fraudulent, you need to provide the login account name that the user is using. So we can see, how have we seen that login account with the device, as we have seen that device and that login in the network of ours. Yeah, so the device identifier that we assign to a device is unique and is based on several different attributes. We do use cookies, but along with cookies, there are, but cookies, as you know, is not very reliable, easily spoofed. So we actually have hundreds of other attributes that we do collect as part of profiling the device, that we feed through an algorithm, and that weights the different factors based upon uniqueness and comes up with a unique ID for the device. Yeah, we call that as a smart identifier. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's almost like bread and butter use cases for us, like location-based signals around a device. If we see a device that we've identified logging in from New York at 10 a.m. and at 10:05 that device is trying to log in, or we are trying to see a login against that account from San Francisco, then we can detect that, right? It's basically it's just not possible physically to do that. So it's not usually one attribute by itself that is used for knowing of these velocity or distance-based detection. It's more than one attribute put together that gives us the ability to know whether this is a fraudulent attempt or not. Does that make sense? Okay. We can talk offline if that didn't fully answer your question. Okay. All right, cool. Any other questions? So for the rest of the discussion, I was going to focus more on the threat metric side of the equation. Like I showed you how the adapter is configured on the ping fed side. We got a lot of good questions on how we do things, but I was going to spend a little bit more time on just talking through how we arrive at the risk. 10 minutes is by any stretch of imagination not enough for that, but I'll probably just scratch the surface here, okay? All right, so device profiling. So what happens during device profiling? So this is just a summary of some of the things that happens. We do things like DNS IP detection. It's very useful in use cases where, sure, you can tell the input IP address of a device, but many of times, like fraudsters are hiding behind proxies. So we can actually do a detection of that and figure out whether the IP, the input IP is the same, the true IP is the same as the proxy IP or not, right? If it's really far away from the DNS IP, then it's a clear indication that, hey, looks like somebody is actually, trying to spoof their location. TAR detection, so these are there are known gateways where, these bad guys sit behind and try to redirect transactions through. So we track those gateways. And every time there's a hit, you actually automatically get a signal for that in your risk policy, and you can do what you want with that signal. So many of these things that you actually see on this page, you as a user don't have to manually configure the rules to detect any of these things or do something with it. I'll talk about our global policy in the end, but we have a global policy that runs for every single event that we see in our transaction. We have a global policy that we configure and monitor that runs, that takes care of actually analyzing all of these different attack vectors. So things like remote desktop detection, time on page. If a human is logging into your website, there is a certain amount of time that they will spend on the page versus a bot trying to do some credential stuffing attack. So we measure the time on page as well, and that's another attribute that you can use in your rules to figure out whether it's a real person trying to log in or some automatic attack. Wireless positioning. So we do this we are able to get the SSIDs of the wireless networks that the mobile phone connects to, and then we do our magic behind the scenes using some data sources, and we can tell you based upon the SSID what's the location of the device, and that's used for detection as well. Man in the browser attack, we have a page fingerprinting capability, which what it does is that we have a snapshot of your valid page, the real web page, and if anytime there is a script or some malware that's trying to inject certain attributes into the page, that will obviously deviate the snapshot of the good page into a bad page, and we compare the snapshots and then use that to know whether, hey, seems like there's been some malware into this page that's trying to capture additional input or change input onto that page. Okay, so that's device profiling. On the types of data attributes leveraged by our digital identity. So as a customer, when they start sending transactions into us, somebody asks, if you don't want to do anything with the risk score that we provide, can we still get the data? The answer is yes, absolutely. And there are 600 plus raw data attributes that you get. Now these span from entities like input IPs to addresses, emails, phone numbers, logins, what have you, basically. And then it's not just those attributes, but there is derived intelligence attributes around those attributes. So the assertions that we've seen around those, the history that we've seen around those, the risk score around those, when have we first seen it, when have we last seen it, the velocity around the age of that behavior, any anomalies that we've seen around attributes, all that entire rich data set is actually returned to you. So there is a lot of different things that you can do with that data set, but that basically forms the crux of our risk decisioning engine. Along with the raw data attributes, we also return the rules that get fired. So all the global policy, the global policy that we run, along with your customized local policies that you run as a customer, every time a certain rule gets fired that is influencing the risk score that we gave you, we will tell you which rule is fired. So it's a very transparent process. So it's typically, we call it as a white box process. If you need to explain to your user or somebody internally why a particular transaction was blocked, you can see all the different reasons, the rules that fired that led to a certain risk score that we arrived at. And Lastly, the key piece here is it's a fully extendable API, so you can also pass in custom inputs into the API. So we have a lot of our customers that pass in custom aspects of their data model that they further use. So the basic infrastructure to track the usage and the velocities and the behavior of these attributes is available for the custom data that you pass into us as well. So all the custom data that you send into us is not added to the global network as such. It's not visible to our entire customer base. It stays locally and isolated to your installation, but you can do all the different rules and decisioning on those attributes that you send into our network. Any questions? Yes, please. Right. Right. Yeah. So good question. So how much time does it take for us to finish the profiling? So we've over the years we've sort of broken down our profiling in a way that it's not an atomic thing where either profiling happens or it doesn't happen. As soon as the page loads, we start collecting data. It can take up to 3 to 4 seconds for the entire profiling to finish, but there are a lot of different things that we just collect as soon as the page happens. So even if the user were to be finishing up with that page in 2 seconds, right? The profiling might have completed in that time. If it not, then there's partial data that we already have collected that's available for decisioning. Okay, great. So last piece here is, so we spoke about the ping fed, how the configuration, we talked about the network, the different data attributes available. And the last piece here is the decisioning engine that basically makes all of this real, right? So just having data is not enough. You got to be able to do something with the data. So this is really a big differentiator for us. We have a sort of proprietary CEP engine that was developed in-house that runs on top of a big data framework. It has a lot of different sophisticated rule types to do things like age-based calculations, velocity, distance-based, complex behavior-based, pattern-based. All of these things can be programmed as rules into the engine, and then all of that is hard to do for a user as the first step. So we have out-of-the-box policy templates for customers to leverage. Based on our experience with working with folks, different banks or e-commerce providers, we've learned enough that we know, for login in a bank, these are certain attack vectors that we typically see. So we can actually leverage that intelligence from one customer to another. So we have those policy templates for you to make use of. And then the next frontier for us is allowing you guys to do these things in an automated way by leveraging machine learning. So along with having these out-of-the-box rules and policies that are available to you, we also allow you to send us some data that are known bad transactions or known bad identities, known bad emails, and so on, that we can then use to train our models and automatically generate a policy that you can deploy. So the key thing here to note here is all the policies that we generate are actually a white box, and by white box I mean that they just look like a regular threat metrics policy. It's not going to look like a machine learning model that you can't read. The output of the machine learning process will be a regular threat metrics policy that you deploy. So just like any policy, when it runs, you will know why a certain score was generated. It's just that the policy was generated by a machine rather than a human. Okay, so the global policy is something that I spoke about already. And so that's not much to cover there, except, so yeah, I don't think we spoke about blacklists, so I get some questions. So usually people have blacklists, especially when it comes to working with the workforce authentication and internal login use cases. There are certain users that are known bad email addresses, or you don't want to let them through. You want to add them to some sort of a list. Yes, the blacklist capability is there out of the box. You get an API to add and remove and update the blacklist, as well as to leverage the blacklist. You have a rule to look up blacklists when a risk policy runs in our network. Great, that's all I got. Any more questions? I'm going to hang around here because there's another session in about 20 minutes where I'll be talking about the integration hub, which is the last piece here. So between now and then, any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, thank you.